Morning, folks. We're back. Um, Hopefully, had a very well rested weekend. The weather was actually quite nice. It still is pretty nice outside. Um, Hopefully, you're having a chance to take advantage of that. I strongly encourage you to do that as well. Get out and just breathe the fresh air. Maybe go for a walk around the neighborhood and try to experience some normalcy again. But anyways, back to the item at hand. We are going to continue on to our look at Unit 4 of the Second World War. Um, we left off looking at the fall of Poland and the Winter War between the Soviet Union and Finland, and we saw the Canadian involvement, and then the occupation of Denmark and Norway. So we've seen the early start of the war. For those of you that have access to Netflix, I would strongly encourage you to look up World War II in color and watch it. It's a series. It actually does a really good job of explaining the war, and it does it in color, and it shows you live footage of things. Yes, I will just make a disclaimer. You do see dead bodies, and you do see a lot of very sad things, but it's okay. If you can stomach that, then I would strongly encourage you to watch it. If you're following along in the booklet, this is page 13. If you are following along on the slides, we are on slide 42. The question we're going to look at today is, what was the early part of World War II like? So we're going to focus really 1939, 1940, maybe a little bit of 1941. So the early parts of the war. The terms are essentially the events that we're going to focus on today is the fall of France, the Battle of Britain, and the Battle of the Atlantic. So we're going to see three major outbreaks of the Second World War in these three moments. So let's just jump right in. We're going to first focus on the fall of France. So Hitler ordered operational plans for an invasion of France in 1939. So remember, 1939 they've invaded Poland, they've invaded Denmark, and they've invaded Norway. Fairly easy going so far. Poland was a little bit more stiff in its resistance, but Norway and Denmark were very quick. It took the Germans 24 hours to take over all of Denmark, so fairly quickly. So in January 1940, German plans fall into French hands. Kind of similar like the Schlieffen Plan. So a reconnaissance plane, it crashes in France, and parts of the plan are known to the French. So there's hopes that the mechanized warfare would bring quick results, the same way that we saw in Poland. So the Blitzkrieg, this lightning war that the Germans had kind of started to master, had knocked Poland out relatively quickly. It had done also really well in Norway. So the Germans are hoping the exact same thing will happen in France. But in France, the Germans are going to be met by something they haven't met yet, and that's a lot more resistance. So the British and the French armies are both in France, and they are waiting for the Germans to come. If you're following along slide 44, there's a map of northern France. It's really important to focus on the maps are really important right now. So that solid red line, that's the Maginot Line. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. And then the dotted red line, that is where the French and the British have set up their armies, because they know that the Germans are not going to go through the Maginot Line, and we'll see why in a minute. But they know that the Germans are going to basically pull this Schlieffen Plan, and they're going to cut through Belgium to come down into France. But this time, the French and the British are hoping that they are ready for it. So, slide 45. This is what the Maginot Line looks like underneath. So, on the surface, you have things like tank barricades, so to prevent tanks. You have barbed wire to prevent soldier and troop movement. You have heavy artillery pillboxes, so basically guns mounted in cement domes to launch artillery. You have machine gun nests, and you can see it's essentially a small underground city that is going to defend France. And France, their entire plan at the start of 1940 is all defensive. They are not thinking we're going to push into Germany. They are 100% solely focused on the defense, mostly because they are of the belief that this war is going to be very similar to World War One. They have the World War One mindset of a static, very slow trench warfare, whereas the Germans are not thinking that. The Germans are thinking fast and to knock out people quickly. So they both come in with two different tactics, and a lot of it is based on the fact that the weapons that the Germans have are very different from what they had in World War One. One thing that we must remember, and this is really crucial, so I would make sure that you are remembering this. After World War One is over, Germany loses a lot of military technology. They lose all their air force. They do not have they have a very, very small navy, a very small army, no tanks, very limited supplies. So from from the end of the war in 1919, after the peace is signed, up until 1939, they've had 20 years to recreate things, and they've created a lot of new things. We're going to talk about a few of them in this video. So that is why the tactics that the Germans have are very different from their World War One days, and that kind of catches the French off guard, because the French are very much in the style of this is going to be like World War One all over again. Anyways, so let's continue. So the Germans are forced to change their plans because they know that the plans have been lost. They're going to change it. So General von Manstein, he is the overall commander of the German army. So he proposes a daring attack, and he realized that Maginot Line cannot be broken. So he's going to do something that the French and the British think is impossible, and they're not prepared for it. And this is what kind of catches them off guard. So what happens is the Germans, they decide instead of attacking north, they're going to switch and go through Luxembourg and through the Ardennes forest. So again, if you're on slide 47 with me here, you're going to see Belgium is the country right next to France. Right below it, very small country. You can't even really read it. It says Luxembourg. They're going to cut through Luxembourg, and then that little bit of dotted line that attaches to that solid red line, that's the Ardennes forest. And they're going to push through there. Because the bulk of the French and the British army, they're either in the Maginot Line or they are actually they've pushed into Belgium. So what the French and the British have done is they've advanced to meet the Germans, not in France but in Belgium, because in Belgium there is a line where two rivers connect, and they felt that this was the best position to meet the advancing German army. So a lot of the French and British have actually gone into Belgium, leaving very few reserve forces in France just in case. So they are not thinking that that the attack is going to go through Luxembourg, because the Ardennes is there, and the Ardennes force is very thick with trees, and they felt that the German tanks could not go through it. We're going to see that they will be quite surprised. So they see the Ardennes forest as impassable. So two German armies attack through Belgium to mislead. So when the British and the French see two German armies attacking in Belgium, they realize, okay, they are doing it. They're doing it all over again, and we're well prepared this time. However, the bulk of the German army is not in Belgium. It is actually going through Luxembourg and through the Ardennes. And what they do is they actually break through the Ardennes forest. So again, if you're following along on the map, where those two dotted lines are at the back, imagine the Germans have now swept behind it. So they've cut off those armies from France, and now they're going to push them to the English Channel. So they're going to push them north. And the French and the British are completely caught off. They did not expect this to happen, and they are in full retreat mode. So the invasion begins in May the 10th, 1940. German tanks move on Belgium and then poised to attack into France. So the French move to counterattack that, but they suffer because the German air force, the Luftwaffe, are dominating the skies. So the German panzers, or their tanks, they break through into northern France, and French communication is so poor, and they didn't know about this breakthrough until May the 14th. So 4 days later, they had no idea that this actually had happened. So the Germans have now broken into France, and they are using this lightning war, this blitzkrieg, that is totally revolutionary. And the French are completely thrown off by it. They've been outmaneuvered, and the German panzer divisions, the tanks, are just running through France at an amazing speed that has not been seen till that point. Because in World War I, we saw the introduction of tanks, but they were really they weren't the best tanks, and they were used differently. So the tanks in World War I were used to basically help soldiers get across no man's land, break in through trenches and things like that. So they had a very different, and they were not the greatest in terms of speed. Now, the tanks of World War II, they're not put amongst different units. They're not spread out. Sorry, I couldn't find the word. They're not spread out. They are actually they're given their own divisions. So that's one of the reasons that France is really taking a beating, is because they've spread their tanks out through each division, where the Germans have made one division. So one group is just tanks, and these are running through France at an alarming speed. This is just a very specific detail, so if you're interested in this stuff, I found this fascinating. There is one division of the German panzers. It gets the name the Ghost Division. The reason it gets the name the Ghost Division is because they get so far ahead that even the German army has no idea where they are. They are led by a very, we'll call him intelligent, tactic-wise, very aggressive, and revolutionary. I think he's a colonel at the time. Erwin von Rommel. Erwin Rommel, no von. We're going to meet him later on, especially when we move to North Africa. But he really knows how to use the tanks of the effectively. So we see in France utter chaos. So the German army is much faster than 1914. It did not need to stop as often. Supply lines kept the pace with the panzers. So they are running fast, and they are being supplied quickly. However, the Germans at this time are still using horses to get supplies across. Obviously, they're using trucks and motorized vehicles, but the bulk of it is on foot and horses. So the Allied armor was not concentrated. Like I said, they had spread it out, which was really. It wasn't technically intelligent, because they cannot concentrate enough to have a very effective counterattack. So they continue to try to counter, but it's not enough. The German armor is concentrated, it's focused. So it's like every time they meet resistance, they smash it because they have such force behind it. And essentially they are pushing all across northern France and pushing their way up towards England because they are trying to capture the German or the French and the British armies. So continuing on, the Belgian army and a third of the French army are encircled. They have wrapped around and they have completely blocked them off. So the British, they are trapped at the port city of Dunkirk, and they are beginning an evacuation of their army. They're in complete full-on retreat. There is no chance to break the German advance. It is too fast. It is too strong. The Germans are bombarding them with advanced weapons that are just too overwhelming at this point. The Germans pause. We still don't know why they do. Some say supply lines. Some say for the bulk of the army to catch up. Because remember, the panzers, the tanks have gone quite fast. But the army is still walking. They are still on foot bringing their soldiers. So we're not sure why. But at Dunkirk, the British are able to move 338,226 soldiers, and they bring them back to Britain. One thing that they do not bring is any sort of equipment. So any sort of tanks, any sort of heavy weaponry. So we're talking artillery pieces, those big cannons, for those of you that didn't know. Those are all left behind, which is a huge blow to the British. But the miracle is that the majority of the army has been brought back to England. It's called The Miracle of Dunkirk. They actually made a movie about it. The trailer will be in this video. So if you haven't seen it yet, I would strongly encourage you to. So the Germans redeploy and drive south to threaten Paris. On June the 10th, Italy declares war against France. It's not really going to do a whole lot. Yes, there is a border that they do cross over into, but think of like a fight between two people. One of them is already on the ground because the guy who he's been fighting the entire time has been beating him up, and all of a sudden the guy's friend comes in and just gives him a swift kick. It wasn't going to change anything. It just showed that the Italians were there. The French government asks to sign a armistice, so a ceasefire, and they're looking for a peaceful way of ending this. So the lower countries, so the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and Belgium, and France, they've all fallen in less than 6 weeks. Northern France, so I'm sure the map will come up. So northern France is occupied by the German army. Southern France and the Empire remain free, and they are reorganized. So the capital is moved from Paris, and it goes to the resort town of Vichy, that is why for the rest of the war we hear Vichy France. It is under a new government led by Philippe Pétain, who was a World War I general, and they collaborate with the Nazis. So they will work with the Nazis. But there is also an underground resistance that begins as the Nazis take over. So France is out. And one thing that I want to, this is just a little side note, just a little bit of information that you may find interesting. When the French asked for peace, the Germans they agreed, and they dig up. I don't know how they did this. They dig up the train car that the Germans were forced to sign the peace of World War I in. So Hitler goes and he gives them the peace. They're all sitting in that train car, and they know what it is. They're realizing that the humiliation has come full circle. And Hitler says, "Sign it," and then he leaves. And they say, "We want a day to think." And then basically the Germans say, "No, you sign it now, or we push on with our invasion." And then the French are forced to sign. So the Germans, they remember, and Hitler uses this as a propaganda tool to remind the Germans and say, hey, this is what they did to us. Now we're going to return the favor. So, as I promised on slide 53, here is a trailer for the movie Dunkirk. If you haven't seen it, it's actually pretty well done. The use of sound is quite interesting in this movie. I would really strongly recommend you have a watch. But anyway, let's move on. So, Slide 54, you can see Hitler as a tourist in France. He is standing there in front of the Eiffel Tower. The man with the kind of cap, not with the front part, the visor, that is a man by the name of Albert Speer. He is actually an architect, and he is Hitler's favorite architect. We'll see what his plans are with Mr. Speer after. See it later. They have plans to rebuild a lot of Germany, but we'll see what happens there. So one other thing, this is just, again, I know a lot of useless information, and I just want to share it with you. Hitler actually cuts the cables of the Eiffel Tower so that nobody's actually able to go on the Eiffel up the Eiffel Tower while there's the German occupation. So I just thought you wanted to know that. You can wow your friends or your families at dinner tonight with that bit of information. Anyways, let us continue on. France is now out of the war. Vichy France is established. So essentially a puppet government now sits and they will basically be yes men to the Germans for the rest of the war. Yes, there is a French resistance underground movement. We'll get to that probably later on because they do help out a lot. Okay, after the fall of France, Britain is alone. We'll use the word alone because they're really not. Canada is British. The British is Britain. Sorry, is Britain's largest ally. Although the war is not, it's not fully in its in full swing. Canada is mobilized for total war. They are fully ready to get the show on the road. So now the Germans turn their attention to the British. Hitler has created this. He has a plan. It's called Operation Sea Lion. It is a naval invasion of England or Great Britain. So by sea, he wants to bring 2 armies. So 30 divisions of infantry, 6 divisions of panzers, 3 divisions of motorized, and then 2 airborne divisions. The airborne is essentially parachute troops. The Germans first used that in the Netherlands and in Norway as well. So they want to do that. So Britain's largely defenseless. Their only equipped units is the 1st Canadian Division, and they are ordered to march all over Britain to appear like Britain has more soldiers. So the British are really afraid of an invasion. So on slide 56, this is essentially what it would have looked like. They were going to leave from France and land on English soil. The reason they wanted to do a land invasion is because they know that the British don't have a strong enough army to resist them. They know that the British Air Force it is capable of some resistance, but they know the British Navy is the most it is the strongest in the world. So they don't want to challenge them in terms of a naval battle, but a physical on the ground battle would probably, Hitler believes, be enough to have the British ask for peace. So we need to focus our attention right now because England is a island. Great Britain. I keep saying England, but it's Great Britain, England, almost the same thing. We know that they're an island, so we have to focus on the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, which was created after World War I. So these are all brand new. They're all brand new planes. So if we look at World War I planes, they're all biplanes. So they're all very old style. These are a lot. These are a lot way more advanced. These 3 planes here are all iconic World War II German planes. So they have 1,000 bombers. So these Helikin 111 bombers. They have 330 dive bombers. So those are the Stuka dive bombers. Those are the ones that when they go down, they make that siren sound. If you watch World War II in color, you'll hear it a lot. And then they also have 1,000 just regular fighters. These are the Messerschmitt 109s. very, very fast, very, very agile equipped planes. They want to use these to destroy the Royal Air Force before it can even get off the ground. They are very aware of the power that the the Royal Air Force has. They are small, they have 800 fighters, but these two planes pictured here on slide 58 are extremely capable. So I believe the larger one is the Hurricane, and the smaller one is the Spitfire. These are very, very fast and very agile planes. They can keep up with the Messerschmitt, and they can do damage to the Helican bombers. And the Germans are aware of this, so they want to make sure that they can knock them down before they even get in the air. The problem for Germany, though, there's many of them. Here are some. They are limited range. Their bombers cannot get to all of Britain. They can only really focus on the southern coast of Britain, which, yes, that does include London, but it has very little access to industrial places like, say, Liverpool, Manchester, and these places farther inland. And fighters could only have a limited escort range as well before they had to go back to refuel. So the bombers were forced primarily to do tactical bombing. So they were not to bomb civilian cities. They were bombing things like airfields, and basically anything related to war, not to attack cities. But the British have a secret weapon. They have developed the use of radar. So essentially they send out sound waves that when they detect an enemy coming, they can tell you how far it is and where it's coming from. So the British radar were able to detect when planes actually left France. So they were able to focus their smaller air force on areas where they knew attacks were coming. So the German pilots shot down, were captured. British pilots could continue fighting. The British also do have help from other countries. So some of the countries that have sent or that have pilots fighting for the Royal Air Force are Poland and Czechoslovakia. These two countries have been invaded by the Nazis, so their armies are out, but their pilots are still fighting for the British Royal Air Force. So the British industry has shifted its attention to making fighter planes now. One of the places that they actually train fighter pilots and they build planes is in Canada. And Alberta, for example, has a special place for this. For those of you that know where Mount Royal is built on a World War II airfield where they would test and train pilots to go and fight in Europe. So the British, they're not totally alone, but they're going to have to fight the Germans at the bulk of themselves. So Phase 1 is from August 13th to August 17th. The Germans attack northern Britain. The German Air Force is not very successful. The Germans lose 250 planes. Phase 2 is from August 24th to September 6th. The Germans switched to southern Britain. They thought, the north, we didn't do very well, let's try the south. And they attack the RAF bases and supply depots and airstrips. They're trying to weaken the Air Force as much as they can. If they can destroy airfields, they can't get their planes off the ground. If they can destroy the planes before they even get off the ground, then that's even more an advantage. And then supply depots. So things like fuel depots. If they can destroy the fuel, then the planes can't fly. The British begin to lose fighters faster than they can produce. The fatigue begins to set in too because pilots are not, they're training them, but when you lose a pilot, it doesn't transfer the knowledge over to someone else. You have to teach somebody how to do that. So the British, one thing that happens, a group of Helican bombers, German bombers, they get lost and they actually bomb London. And that is the first time they've targeted civilians. Yes, it was by mistake, but it still happened. And the British respond by bombing Berlin. So 81 bombers, 29 actually reach the target, and they attack Berlin, and Hitler is furious. This begins what's known as Phase 3, or the Blitz. So Hitler ordered the Luftwaffe to attack London in retaliation for the attack on Berlin. London is heavily damaged because of this. 43,000 civilians killed and over 1 million are wounded. This shift, though, from attacking just RAF supply airstrips and military installations, it allows the Royal Air Force enough time to rebuild and then focus defending on London. And Hitler, in his rage, decides to postpone Operation Sea Lion. Also, he is persuaded to do this because of the leader, or the head of the German Air Force, Field Marshal Hermann Goering. Sorry, Air Marshal Hermann Goering, who's also a leading Nazi and a World War I fighter pilot, actually. He's also a drug addict too, but we'll get into that probably later. He says that his Air Force can force the British to surrender. So they postpone the land invasion, which some historians have argued, if it would have happened, Britain may have been forced to surrender, because the British Army, remember, it had lost all of its heavy equipment, and it wouldn't have been well equipped to do much than defend. And if the Germans poured enough pressure, they could have forced potentially a surrender. So slide 62. Here's a 3-minute video of the Battle of Britain. Strongly recommend you give that a watch. So back to what we talked about, this idea of Britain standing alone, or Britain against the Axis powers. So this myth of the darkest hour, from their finest hour speech. So Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of Britain, he gives this rousing speech in Parliament where he's basically saying, we're not going to surrender, we're going to fight to the last man, regardless of the pressure, we're going to fight them all over. But in 1940, here is a list of the countries that are actually supporting the British and fighting the Germans. There is Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, Bahrain, Nepal, Newfoundland, Oman, and Samoa. There's 5,000 Irish volunteers have joined the British Army. There are countries that are conquered that are still fighting, who have soldiers. So in France, Poland, and in Czechoslovakia, these underground movements, like we talked about, they are fighting, and they are doing things like sabotage. They're doing things like disrupting communication. They're doing things like spying, gathering information. So the British also have their entire empire as well. So this includes India. So are they really alone? Not really. They have quite a lot of allies. Do any of these allies alone stand a chance of defending against a German invasion? No, they don't. But together, they do pose a strong resistance to the Germans. So that's the Battle of Britain. That part of the war will eventually just die off, and then Hitler will focus his attention elsewhere because he realized that he can't just knock the British out like he did the French and all those other countries before that. So we will shift our attention, because that part of the war essentially just dies out like a candle that's run out of wick. But anyways, let's focus our attention to the Battle of the Atlantic, because remember, the British have the largest navy in the world. They also have the largest empire, and a lot of their supplies are coming from that empire. So they need to be able to protect these supply lines. But that situation is really difficult for the British. So once Britain is safe from the Luftwaffe, they still need to strike out at Germany. So supplied ships to Britain from across the world were necessary. They couldn't do this war on their own. They needed those allies that we talked about, who were sending supplies and soldiers. So the Royal Navy was stretched thin. It had to protect the entire empire and defend Britain as well. So when I say it's spread out, we're talking things like convoy protection. So you have a bunch of supply ships having to be protected by naval ships. You'll have to have them protecting the coast of the empire from invasion. So the Royal Canadian Navy is given the task of protecting the convoy. Then they're unprepared for this. The reason they're unprepared for it is because the Germans have really stuck with the idea of the U-boat. So the Kriegsmarine, the German Navy, has 46 U-boats. And this is their best way of attacking these supply lines. The Germans begin to build submarine bases in France, so they're able to extend their range. This is something they couldn't do in World War One because they hadn't conquered France. They only had bases in northern Germany, so places like Hamburg were where the German Navy had to come out of. Now they can leave out of France, so they can go into the Atlantic to strike at the supply lines. They had a surface fleet, so this idea of the pocket battleship, smaller battleships, but they were not as effective as the submarines. The submarine commander is the man pictured here on slide 65, Admiral Karl Dönitz. He actually becomes quite important in 1945. We'll get to that when we get to the end of the war. So let's remember Admiral Dönitz for a second here, looking all regal in his Navy uniform. Anyways, so Dönitz organized the U-boats into what's known as wolf packs. These are essentially small groups of submarines, and they would go into the Atlantic, and they would look for convoys. And when they found one, they would submerge and they would go on the attack. And essentially, they would go under, and a ship wouldn't even, if they didn't have things like sonar, they wouldn't even know that they were there. All they would know was when they were hit by a torpedo and they started to sink. They are effective and they are very devastating. They were attacking the convoy ships, they were attacking the escorts, so the British were losing battleships because they had really only a few tools to attack these U-boats. So let's focus on the Royal Canadian Navy. They begin acquiring and building ships. So their job is now to defend these convoys. They go to the United States. At the time, President FDR, Franklin Roosevelt, he has this idea of the Lend-Lease. So he gives Canada 50 old, or the Canada and the British 50 old World War I destroyers. Canada gets 7 of them. So they have these 2 ships right here, for example, the Flower and then the HMCS Ottawa. These are just 2 ships that are given. They are going to have to they are tasked with defending these convoys as they cross the Atlantic, which is extremely difficult because they have very limited weapons that they can actually use against a submerged U-boat. Because it's different. You can't use an artillery piece to shoot something that's under the water. So the weapon of choice to fight against these U-boats or what is known as depth charges. So imagine, it essentially looks like a barrel. You would launch it off your ship and it goes into the water and then it blows up under the water. What you're hoping to do is to either cause a hole in the U-boat and have it sink, or force it to come out of the water because it's damaged, and then that's when you would attack. And it could be launched from boats and it can be launched from planes. Here on slide 68 is a 6-minute video of the Battle of the Atlantic and Canada's contribution to that. So, what was the early part of World War II like? This is the summary of what we just talked about. So, we have to look at what's happened. So, the fall of France, it's happened fast, it's happened quick. We saw that the Germans changed up the plan from World War I. the French were very much ready for a static, slow war. The Germans wanted fast. They got fast. They knock out France. And they attempt to knock out the British, but they're unsuccessful. So we see that they're not as invincible as they had once looked when they were taking things like France, the Netherlands, Belgium, Denmark, Poland, Norway, these sort of places. But for the most part, the early part of the war is very much Axis superiority and Axis triumph. They have invaded basically all of Western Europe has been conquered. Northern Europe has been taken, Denmark and Norway, which means that the Swedish iron ore that is needed to build these tanks and these weapons is safe, and it will continue to be supplied to the Germans. We see that the British Empire is having to battle the Germans alone. Because the United States is not in the war yet. Yes, the United States is supplying the British with weapons, with tanks, with bullets, with guns, with ships, with anything that they need. But they're not in the war yet. In the East, the Soviets, they are not helping the British. They don't have any need to. They've invaded Finland, and they are just happy with what they have right now. But they're going to realize that the alliance with Hitler that they have right now is not going to last for too long. So that is it for today. It was quite a long video, but it's okay. It was full of important information. So continue doing the assignments. Continue to send in your stuff that you may have been missing. Continue to do the quizzes, and then and that's about it. Stay safe and enjoy the lovely day.